Welcome to Go Get Great, the podcast for aspiring entrepreneurs and ambitious small business owners. I'm your host, Brittany, owner of Brittany Miller Socials and mother of 3. Go Get Great is all about helping you make life and business work together. You'll learn about the fumbles that helped get me and my guests to where we are today so you don't have to make them. So come join the journey with Go Get Great. All right. Welcome back to the Go Get Great podcast. Grayson and I have been working with some new clients lately, supporting them with their podcasting efforts. And we've really been talking a lot about how to create a strong intro and outro for your podcast. So the purpose of an intro and outro for your podcast is to help new listeners get to know you and your podcast. And it sets the tone for what they can expect when they listen to the episodes that they've clicked on. And then at the end, your outro gives them information about how they can continue the conversation or potentially even work with you if you have a business that is related to your podcast. So they aren't mandatory, but they do set the tone and add a level of professionalism to your podcast. So I have brought Grayson back on today so that we can talk about how you can create an intro and outro for your podcast, one that wows your audience and keeps them coming back for more. So good morning, Grayson. Do you want to say hi?
Hi.
Always feels weird when I say good morning when I'm recording because I know that they come out in the morning, but it's like 8 o'clock at night when we're recording this. Okay. So anything you wanted to add before we dive in about the purpose of intros and outros? No? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so what to include in an intro? What are some of the bare minimum basics that you need to cover?
I think you should always have the title of your podcast in there for sure. And then honestly, you can kind of go anywhere from there. I like having generally what your podcast is about. So anybody who's just randomly clicking on it and is listening to the first 30 seconds will immediately know what they're getting into. But other than that, you can kind of pick whatever you want. I just wouldn't make it too long unless it's like an excellent intro.
Fair. Yeah, so that's something that I think as podcast hosts, we don't always think about when we're creating our intros is that we know what we talk about. Oftentimes we do like a pilot episode too when we first get started. So we've told everyone, or we think we've told everyone, about who we are and what it is that we do and what we talk about on our podcast. But the reality is that people join our podcast at varying stages, especially as your business grows and you promote it on social media. Maybe the first episode they listen to is episode 23 or 157.
Yeah.
So really the purpose of the introduction is to kind of get them to know you in a very short period of time so that they don't have to go back and listen to your introductory episodes because not everyone is interested in doing that.
It's especially important because people that are looking for a new podcast might not necessarily want to listen to your first episode because it should be your worst episode because it is the first time you've done it.
True.
So I always listen to their latest episode of whatever podcast I'm going to. So you want to make sure that they're hooked immediately or they'll just move on to something else.
So I am the type of person that likes fill in the blank scripts, especially when doing something like this. So a simple one that you can use for your intro to kind of get started is say, hi, I'm so-and-so, the host of insert podcast name and or owner of blank business. We're here to talk about XYZ and insert a few examples of some of the things you talk about on your podcast. So it can be as simple as that, truthfully, or it can be more complex. If you guys have listened to the introduction of my podcast, which I assume you have, unless you've skipped through it to get to this point in the episode, you can kind of use that as an example and a benchmark of what you could include in your introduction. Yeah. Okay. Well, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything else. I think that there are a few other things that you can include in your introduction. I sometimes like to mention who the podcast is best suited for. So for example, for women who are ready to say yes to, entrepreneurship or a life on their own terms, something like that. Mine is so that for small business owners who want to confidently grow their business in a way that's aligned with their life. So that's not word for word what I say in my introduction, but the general kind of sentiment is that my podcast is designed for entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, and small business owners. So I want to make sure that I'm noting that in my introduction so people can very clearly say, okay, yes, I'm going to learn something by listening to this podcast. Or you know what, that doesn't really apply to me. I'm not really interested in starting a business. My podcast is probably not a great example for this because I also throw in random episodes every now and again where I'm talking about our personal budget or Grayson and I's relationship status and what we've learned in therapy. So my podcast is a little bit more all over the board. Most people kind of focus in on like one specific topic or the niche for their podcast, and that's what you would want to talk about, what the niche is and who the niche is best suited for.
Yeah. Honestly, that part can be like pretty short. If like some podcasts will just start with like, it's the whatever podcast, we talk about this, and then it starts. But it needs to be like interesting, I would say, because if the first thing you hear when somebody starts talking on a podcast is that like basically the reading off a sheet saying like, hello, this is the Brittany Miller, or sorry, Go Get Great. We talk about blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? Like it gets so boring that you're just going to immediately bail because it needs to have some level of entertainment for it to be entertaining.
That actually brings up two other things that I wanted to mention about your introduction. So the first thing is that I don't recommend that you just read like the mission statement for your podcast. Mission statements are usually for the business owner to know the purpose of what they're doing. It gives them a place that they can always come back to if they feel like they've gotten off track. It's not usually relevant, interesting, or engaging for the people that are listening to your podcast. So you should craft something separate as a script for your introduction before you record that is not your mission statement. Mission statements are also usually a little bit longer than podcast intros should be. So I don't recommend that.
Yeah, it's also like Brittany said, just not relevant to a podcast because usually the mission statement of your business has like nothing to do with what you're actually talking to in a podcast unless your business is your podcast, in which case you might not like need a mission statement for that type of thing anyway.
And I mean, we've seen people that write mission statements specifically for their podcast too, but again, they're usually much longer and they include a lot of information that's not necessarily relevant for the listener. But the second thing that I wanted to mention kind of in and around what Grayson was talking about, I'll pause it. Okay, and the second thing that I wanted to mention based on what Grayson said is the introduction is the first thing that people hear, which I think we've said multiple times, but it's really crucial that it is upbeat, exciting, and engaging, not only in the audio you choose, which we will talk about more later, because I know music is a really important kind of piece of the introduction, but in general, how energetic you are when you're saying your introduction is really important and helps set the tone too. If you're like very monotone and that's how you talk in your podcast, then okay. But you do want to try and be a little bit excited because you want to get your listeners engaged before they have even made it to the content of your podcast. So I know it can feel super silly, but it truly makes a difference if you're like really animated when you're recording your introduction. So like if you guys ever watch the video versions of my podcast on YouTube, you'll notice that I have a lot of hand gestures and like I'm moving around because I know if I were to like sit still and talk into a microphone, it is not going to sound nearly as good for you as it would if I pretend that I'm actually having a conversation with someone when I record, which is also why it's nice to have guests like Grayson here because it feels more like a conversation so you can be more animated when you're saying it. And that translates better to the quality of the recording when people listen to it. It's like why people tell you to smile when you're talking to people on the phone or do anything related to that, because even though they can't see it, it comes across for the person on the other side.
Yeah, and people will know if you're just basically reading something. Like you might think it's not coming across like that, but you kind of have to believe in what you're saying.
Yeah. So those are some of our tips for creating an introduction. So we also wanted to share some tips and recommendations for creating an outro for your podcast as well, because that's a little bit different and has a different purpose. So it needs to have different content to go along with it. So what do we start with?
Start with in the outro.
Yeah.
Just say thank you.
Yes, I mean, at its very basic level, you do want to thank people for listening.
Just basically like engage directly with your audience, like talk to them.
So a lot of people will do kind of like a mini wrap up at the end of their episode, which is great, but you usually still want to have an outro that goes at the end of every podcast, one for cohesion so that you are starting and ending your podcast on the same note for people, and also because you won't usually remember what it is that you need to include in your outro or what you usually say unless you're like reading off a script when you record. So it's great to have kind of that set piece. You don't have to worry about thanking people for listening and then reminding them to subscribe to your podcast. You can, if you want to, tell them where it's available. I have mixed feelings about that sometimes. Be like, subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts.
They're already listening to it.
Yes, because they already are listening. So it's okay to remind them to subscribe, but you don't necessarily have to say on what platforms because they've obviously found you if they have made it to the outro. So they know how to get a hold of your podcast. But the other thing for me is that oftentimes the platforms that you have your podcast available on change throughout your podcasting journey. Like you usually never take them away, but like I know I added Google Podcast like months in. And if I had listed, subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and I'd probably feel compelled to go back in and redo my outro because I added another platform. So it saves you kind of an extra layer of work and updating. It takes away that level of updating if you don't include that information in there for people and just assume that at a base level, people are smart enough to know that if they found you once, they can find you again.
Especially considering the fact that the way you upload podcasts is like in one base list. So if you add another podcast platform later, it's not like those previous episodes won't be there. So you're kind of just like lying at the end of those episodes because it's not there.
Yeah. And I will say that you should tell people where to listen to your podcast in your social media content. So I'm not saying like never mention it, but don't necessarily put it in your outro. I don't think that it's very important there. I think another important thing for outros is that you can include a short reminder about what your podcast is about, especially if you have multiple different topics that you talk about. Again, my podcast is a great example. It's a hot mess of everything, but mainly focused on marketing and small business life, because the specific episode that they listen to might not necessarily be related to the next episode that you release. Especially, again, if you have those different topics. So you can say, hey, we talk about these 3 things, but the episode they listen to might only cover one of them. And
I would probably front load like any call to actions you have, because that's kind of the point of your outro. Like if you're just gonna give like a little mini spiel, kind of like your intro, people are probably just gonna skip it every single time because it doesn't have any actual importance. But if you have like, come follow me on social media, join my Facebook group here, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff is probably what you want to put right at the start so they can potentially hear it before they click off to the next episode or a different podcast.
Yeah, exactly. So call to actions is something else that I was going to mention. So thank you for reminding me of that, because that invites people to either follow you on socials, which is great because then they'll get reminders about when your podcast episodes are coming out, because you should be talking about them on social media. And it's also an opportunity for you to utilize your podcast to support your business goals, which is usually related to an invitation for people to work with you or to purchase a product. So you can mention those specifically in the episode when it's relevant, but you could also have just like a general call to action. Hey, if you're looking for support with your social media, you can use the link in the show notes to book a one-on-one call with me. So something that's general and applies to all of the things that you would talk about in your podcast, not specific ones. But that's a great way for you to grow your business and support your business goals with the podcast that you're already producing anyway. So I definitely do love those. Having calls to actions for social media should definitely be included. Adding a more specific like business call to action is a little bit more optional, because I know not everyone has a podcast that's directly related to the content or the service that they offer in their business. So if it aligns, then do it. This is actually not something that I've included in my outro right now, and I was telling Grayson the other day that I probably want to re-record so that I can add it.
You can also, for outros, like not have a pre-recorded one, just because it flows together better with your episode sometimes. So a lot of the podcasts I listen to just they have like a kind of a set script that they say at the end of their episodes every time. And that way you can also kind of change it up a little bit so people are more likely to listen to your outro every single time you you have an episode, which is obviously then going to more likely get them to join your Facebook group or something. Because if they listen to one episode and they know what your outro says and they never listen to it again, chances are they're probably not joining your Facebook group the first time they hear it because they don't know who you are or care. So if you can get them to keep listening to your outros, then you're going to have a higher chance of people going there because they're constantly reminded that it's something that you have.
There's another way to look at it. It kind of directly contradicts what I just said, but that's okay.
No, and I get that, but you would still have a script in the first place. So like you would still have your call to actions, you would still have the certain things that you would be bringing up. But like if you have certain news specific things, like even in your episodes, you have like this kind of, as soon as you start wrapping up, where can we find you on social media? Like it's the same wrap up. It's just you also have a pre-recorded thing at the end. So like if you just extended it, you could have, a changing outro or something. Or it's a lot less noticeable when the transition happens, so people are still going to listen to it.
That's fair, I guess. I mean, I do that mainly because obviously when I have guests on my podcast, I haven't pre-recorded where people can find my guests. So I have to ask the guests at the end of each episode. But then the outro is so that I don't ever have to remember about giving anyone my info. So I love that it's pre-recorded so that I never have to stress about making sure that I included all of that information.
Yeah, it's also way easier to just put the outro in. Then you just don't have to remember to actually do an outro every time.
Yeah. So your outro should be short. Like, what's a good? I mean, it can be varies,
longer,
but
it can be longer than your intro because chances are people are just going to go off of your podcast before your outro starts playing anyways. So as long as you front load like your calls to actions, it barely matters. It's not like if they hit like a 4-minute intro, they're going to stop listening, right? If you hit like a 4-minute,
true.
If you hit like a 4-minute outro, they're gonna hear your call to actions, and then maybe they'll click off before the end of it, anyways. Like a lot of people aren't listening to outros as much anyway.
Yeah, that's fair. In general, we didn't mention this in the intro section, but in general, I would say that your introduction should be
30 seconds.
Yeah, like 30 seconds or less is good. Like there are some podcasts that I listen to, like Amy Porterfield's, and she's got a pretty aggressive introduction. And it's like a minute long. And honestly, when I know that I'm listening to her episodes, when I hit play, I hit the skip button 4 or 5 times so that I don't have to listen to the same 1 minute of her introduction.
You generally don't want your viewers to know exactly how long your intro is to skip it every single time. How many times you have to press the 15 seconds ahead button before they know that your episode's going to start is generally meaning your intro is too long.
Yeah. So like that's an example. So I would say, 30 seconds or less is usually good. People will like usually sit through that without, too much grumbling because it's not too much time. And then like Grayson said, your outro can be a little bit longer. Okay, so I want to switch and talk about music now because now we've kind of given you, that is not even we've given you some suggestions on the wording that you can use when you actually write your intro or outro. I'm going to call it a script, but when you actually say that. So the next kind of important and crucial piece is music. And I would say that this is like kind of mandatory because you need to be able to have a distinct difference.
It sounds boring. It's like really weird when especially if it's pre-recorded. So like if you just have an intro to your podcast that you're saying every time you go in, you could probably go without it. But if it's pre-recorded, it kind of sounds dead. Like if people know it's pre-recorded and you didn't put music into it, it sounds a little bit weird. I think only like 2 podcasts I've ever listened to just don't have any music at the start whatsoever.
So that's something that you want to make sure that you have kind of on your to-do list when you're creating your introduction is to come up with music. And I think one of the biggest things that we see is that people get to this point and they're just like, I don't know what to do. So then they'll pick like a popular song and be like, oh, we'll just use that, which is like, that's a no for me. Grayson, do you want to explain why?
I I mean, I would think it's pretty self-explanatory, but if you know what copyright is, yeah, so you obviously can't pick famous songs because they're copyrighted, and you have a high chance of not, well, either your podcast just being taken down in general, or you're like legally not allowed to earn any money off of other people's music and stuff like that. So you might run into some, litigation issues down the road if you're going to keep doing that. So
And I mean, we've heard the argument before too, that's like, oh, well, I don't think my podcast is ever going to make money. And I mean, that can be a fair thing to think when you're getting started, but then, what if it does, whether you
but
get,
also, even if it doesn't, if you're using it for like your business, let's say, it kind of gets into like a legal gray area where you can't use famous songs in advertising, and if your podcast is basically an advertisement for your business, they could probably pull something out.
So in general, we do not recommend that. We would, however, recommend that you find unlicensed music. That's not the right term for it, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Unlicensed music, or like websites that have free music available for you to use.
Yeah, and you want to make sure too, when you use stuff like that, that it's actually allowed to be used for commercial use, because sometimes they'll be like, you can use this song for like your dumb YouTube video or something, but when you actually look at
Let's not call people's YouTube videos dumb, babe.
No, but I mean, what it'll like say, you can just like, you can use it, but it's not necessarily for commercial use. So like, let's say for an advertisement, you can use the song to make your own content, but you can't use the song for an advertisement without paying extra or getting a license to use it for commercial use.
And some people too don't necessarily want you to purchase things, but even if you're using like an editing app like InShot, let's say, and you want to pull from their music library, you'll notice that it does come up with the disclaimer saying that you're supposed to credit the artist in the post. So that would mean that every time you put your podcast up, that you need to have something in the description of the podcast crediting the artist for the music. Which
things like SoundCloud too. Like mostly everything's free on there, and there are sometimes when you get music, it'll be like, you can download this and use it, but you have to do blank thing, and it'll make you do it before you can even download it to use it. So you just kind of have to watch out for stuff like that. Especially even if you like, pay for a song on like a music library for like $4, you want to make sure sometimes there'll be like an option that'll say like commercial use, and it'll like up the price, but you can actually properly use that song.
we're definitely pro not having your podcast taken down by because you're not following the rules. So SoundCloud, you mentioned, is a great option. Do you know of any other websites that are good for getting like royalty-free music for podcasts?
Yeah. You honestly, there's like thousands of them. So one of them is like Free Sound Library. They have like sound effects and music and stuff like that. And they're free. But I think there's also the limitation of some of them can be used for commercial and some of them can't. So you kind of have to be choosy with it. And sometimes it's hard to find something you really like lengthwise and stuff like that. So sound libraries can be useful, and then sometimes they really can't. Like you're almost always better off paying somebody to make a song for the thing you are doing, but obviously the cost goes up for stuff like that. So you also don't want to end up with the same song as somebody else if it's in a sound library. I mean, it doesn't happen a lot, but there have been times where I hear background music in a video. I'm like, I think I've heard this before because somebody else has used it in their video too, and it just so happened to be the best song on whatever sound library.
Yeah. And I think that that brings up a good point too. So like when we work with clients, we will obviously do whatever it is that the client wants. But our preference is usually to record our own music clip for podcast intros and outros. When we put those together, you guys know that Grayson did the music for mine. He did the music recently for one of our other clients too. So can you share a little bit about how that process works? If someone themselves is musically inclined, they could do it themselves instead of outsourcing to someone. But if you are in a place where you're like, you know what, I would pay someone to do that, you can probably find someone on Fiverr or something like that to record a music clip for you. Grace and I have a podcast setup package as well, where we can do a custom like intro and outro creation for you. And part of that service would include us recording the music for your podcast based on kind of your musical preferences. But how do you do that?
Yeah. So, well, first off, I would say Fiverr can work, but
Yeah,
the problem is you'll probably end up having to pay more than $5. Like you'll end up at a pretty comparable cost to just finding a composer and having them do it. Just because a lot of Fiverr artists will say, "Oh, I'll write you a custom song," and they've just got 50 songs they've wrote randomly, and they'll just pull one out and throw it at you, and you'll be like, "This is nothing what I am looking for." But if you're musically inclined, it would honestly probably be faster and easier for you to just make something that you know is what you want than like when you look at sound libraries, you can go for hours and just find nothing even close to what you're looking for, and they don't even sound that great. So if you're looking to record, so it kind of depends. If you're using like, for instance, you can use like an electric keyboard or something. Some of them you can just plug right into your computer. Get what's called a DAW, which is it basically just records music and will let you take an electric piano, and then you can like pick different piano noises, stuff like that, even drums, stuff like that. So you can just record music through that. So things like Ableton or FL Studio, stuff like that, they'll just let you in a free version kind of make a more basic song. I'm trying to think. There are free ones.
Audacity to record ours?
Yeah, so I just use Audacity, but I'm also using acoustic instruments. So I'm literally just taking a microphone, putting a guitar in front of it, and then playing a song, and then I just leave the recording like that, and then I do some.
So it depends on the instrument you're playing.
Yeah, exactly. So I was gonna say, if you want something like an electric guitar, you're gonna need to get an audio interface and then a plug that will plug into your guitar and then into the audio interface and then plug into your computer, and then you have to get a DAW to simulate an amp. So you'll have to do some research on stuff like that to do it. You can also get a DAW and then use your keyboard. Like if you hit like A, it'll make a certain note, or S, it'll make a certain note, and then you can pick electric guitar in the thing. It's kind of noticeable. It won't sound exactly like an electric guitar exactly, but you can kind of make something like that. So you'll probably have to do some research on it, because it's a lot more than I can possibly explain right now. But if you're looking at acoustic instruments, you're going to need a microphone. You'll probably need a higher end microphone, because you're looking at different like high level frequencies and low level frequencies. So you need a good microphone that can catch all of that. If you're looking at electronic instruments, you'll need a DAW. It'll probably be easier if you have like a MIDI keyboard in front of you, so you can like actually hit the notes. And if you're looking at like electric equipment, you're going to need an audio interface and then the cables associated with it, and a DAW. So there are free DAWs and there are paid ones, but you can probably figure those out if you type in best DAWs. That's DAW, by the way.
Which we will link in the show notes for people like me who would have not spelled it that way. We'll also link our microphone recommendation and the audio interface that we use for your convenience too. Yeah, so I mean, recording music is obviously, like I said, if you're musically inclined, probably the best way to go, because like Grayson mentioned, you know exactly what it is that you want, and you likely have the instruments at home. If you're planning on having a podcast, you've probably already also purchased the microphone. So chances are you have a lot of the equipment already needed to do it. You just need to spend a couple minutes thinking about what it is that you want and then actually recording it. So that is a great way to go. And then you avoid all of the potential legal issues of needing to find a royalty-free music clip for your podcast. So kind of a related question that I have had about putting an intro and outro together is, well, how much music goes before the talking and how much goes after, because you have to overlap the intro into like the start of the podcast.
Yeah. So before is kind of like a two-pronged question, because if you have video, like you're doing like a video podcast and putting it on YouTube, let's say, you're gonna need some video to fill the space where you're not talking for the intro, because obviously there is music at the start where there's no talking. So you're gonna want to make sure you have a proper amount of video, and then maybe just go from there and figure out how much you need. For just doing audio, you can, do what you want. I would put, I don't know, 5 to 10 seconds of like a song before. Depends, like if you're getting royalty-free music, let's say, that's the word, royalty-free music.
Okay.
Anyway, if you're getting royalty-free music and it has like lyrics, you might want to have, the chorus end before you like fade it down into whatever, or you'll have like a certain guitar part play and then you want it to come down. So you'll probably want to line it up in some way before you start talking. But I would say like 5 to 10 seconds where it just sounds nicer to have it play louder and then fade down. And then at the end, it kind of depends. Like, again, if you've got like lyrics in there, you're gonna want probably a natural part, either literally the end of the song or a natural part where like it fades down on its own. So you're not like in a really high intensity part and then all of a sudden it like fades out and it doesn't really seem that natural. So it'll depend on the song. I like, for like you've probably heard in Brittany's intro, it to just like let a note ring out or like a chord ring out, and then it'll just, naturally fade out on its own. Obviously, because I'm recording the music myself, I can just luxury. Do it. I can just make it do that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, about that.
Okay, so 5 to 10 seconds at the beginning and then a little bit at the end. And then when you're talking about all of this fading, this is like over my head kind of stuff. That's why I have you. You do all of that. I'm going to call it editing in post, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess I don't do it for the guitar in your intro. I just let the note ring out and then there was no fading out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But for the people that need to do that, where do you do that? Where do you like put it all together and make all of those audio adjustments?
So I just do it in Audacity. So Audacity's free. It's very popular too. So like I would use it because you will find tutorials all over the place for it. Because if you start going to like a bunch of different stuff, you might have a hard time finding tutorials for them. Mm-hmm. Audacity is perfect. It's been around forever and it's really popular and it's free, like completely free. You're not going to get like bugged to pay for it or anything. Mm-hmm. So I like doing Audacity. It's perfect. I'm not downloading a bunch of like extra, like what's called plugins for it. It just kind of works for what I need it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. And I mean, I've used Audacity too on days where Grayson's not here and I needed to do some minor audio stuff myself. And it is relatively like beginner user friendly, I'm going to say. You guys know that I recently got a MacBook, and while we were at the store, they were like showing me a tutorial of the audio system on here, which I don't even remember what it's called. Do you? GarageBand, that one. Yeah. And I was like looking at it, and what they were testing or showing you in the thing, there were like rows and rows and buttons. I was like, oh my God, I do not ever want to try and use that.
So to be fair, if you have a Mac, I would recommend using GarageBand.
Okay, well, I don't think it looks very user-friendly.
It is. That GarageBand is more like a DAW, like I was talking about before. So like it has like virtual instruments and you can like layer tracks. The thing about Audacity, so like when you use a DAW, it'll have all the instruments separated out separately, and you can like edit them separately. Audacity just works with audio, so you can only record or drop an audio clip in, and then it's just the audio, which makes it easier if you're like brand new to it. You just see the audio, and then you don't have to worry about anything else. It makes it really hard when you're working with music with multiple tracks because you kind of don't know what everything is and you're just seeing the sound waves. So it's not like you can see where the beats are. I mean, you can if you're looking at it, but it's harder. So if you're editing a podcast, Audacity is pretty good because it's all just audio. And if you're working in finished audio clips, you don't have to like edit them too much. You just drop them in and you can just put them wherever you want.
Okay. So Audacity is great for podcasts. GarageBand would be great for intro and outro creation.
And I'm pretty sure you can get Audacity on a Mac, so I guess it doesn't really matter. You can just use Audacity.
Well, let me download it. I haven't actually opened it yet, but it physically exists on the Mac, so I'm going to say that it's mine. But it makes sense that you would want to use GarageBand because MacBooks were actually like created for music people, right?
I mean, they were made for working, I would say creative. So they're really good for graphics work. They're really good for music. They're really good for video. Pretty much any type of editing is like really good. So like a Macs are kind of useless for like gaming and stuff, but like
worked great for me, which is why I forked out what felt like a lot of money to get it. Okay, so transitioning topics away from why Brittany bought a MacBook. We've talked about what to include in your scripts, how short or long it should be, getting music for it, how to record music on your own if you wanted to do that. Oh, what I want to talk about is video. So we've talked a lot about the audio piece of it, but for any of you guys that have a video version of your podcast that you put up on YouTube, like I do, there's a few kind of additional things that you'll need to consider throughout this process. So Grayson kind of mentioned one of them earlier. You need to have some sort of video footage that will go during the music playing before the actual talking happens. So when you record your intro and outro, if you have a video version, you need to make sure you record a video version of you saying the intro and outro.
Or
that would be good.
It doesn't even need to be you saying it. It could just be a video that has to, like,
B-roll.
If you watch any TV show, you know what I mean? Like the music's playing, the intro or the credits are coming up, and let's say you're watching like House, there's doctors doing like doctor things and stuff like that. So if you're like a business oriented podcast, it could be somebody on a computer with a cut to somebody doing marketing stuff and writing things down. You know what I mean?
I love Grayson. He has literally no idea what I do, and it's been 2 years.
But then you just overlay the audio over top of it. So it doesn't necessarily need to be you just sitting there. In fact, I would almost recommend it isn't just you sitting there saying it, unless you have something like interesting, like some kind of interesting background, or like you're doing somewhere oh, geez. You are somewhere interesting. Like, a lot of people record it just, on Zoom like this, and it's kind of odd when you're just sitting there saying it. In this room, it's not particularly interesting.
I find that videoing me saying it is the easiest way to get it checked off the to-do list if you're in the process of getting your podcast started and set up. Because to me, I mean, technically speaking, I can edit B-roll. I do that all the time for social media, but it feels different to do it for video. So to be able to piece like 30 seconds of B-roll together in a horizontal format. Well, I'm always saying vertical for Instagram, but for YouTube, it's horizontal, would be very different and challenging. Honestly, I would have to go out and take high quality, like professionally videoed video footage to use for YouTube, because everything that I film is upright for Instagram.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's honestly kind of rare to have the video around too, because unless you are filming for YouTube, like what's the point in taking horizontal video anymore?
Or your website. But I mean, most people don't do
most
specific.
Don't have a website, right?
It depends on the business. But that's a good point. So you can record yourself saying it, or you can edit together some B-roll to use for either the whole or part of it. Or oftentimes what we do for our clients is we will create a custom graphic in Canva that's sized appropriately for YouTube and is just kind of a picture of their
And they'll just
podcast cover art.
it just fills in that first 5 to 10 seconds of music that's playing before they start speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And as with videoing for anything, if you're doing a video version of your podcast, you should know this already, but you're going to want to find a quiet location to record in, so you don't have external sounds that you're trying to edit out of your recording later. I usually also recommend somewhat of a neutral and or interesting background, but not something that's like super busy, especially if you need to put text on the screen over top of it. Like if I was talking through my whole intro outro, I'm probably still going to want the writing that says "Go Get Great." I'm going to cover your face here. I would still probably want it to say "Go Get Great" somewhere during the introduction. So I can't overlay the text for my podcast title if the background is like super chaotic. So just kind of some video tips for that way. Anything else you want to add about?
Yeah, just one more
YouTube
thing
version?
in the intro. If it is just you sitting there like saying it, you also want to make sure for the end of it the music doesn't last too much longer than when the person's talking, because you can't just put another title card there. So you kind of want to make sure, like in Brittany, she walks off the frame and then I fade it out and then fade the actual video in as well. The music still plays longer than that, but since it's just a note ringing out, I can just let it go over them talking at the start of the episode and there's no problems. But if you have too much space between it where you want it to play and there's nobody talking, you're just left with either a person standing there not saying anything or a black
Freeze
space.
frame. Yes. So there are a lot of things that you can do to like really professionalize your intro and outro, which is a lot of what we've been talking about, but you can also keep it super simple. And like, obviously having a video version for YouTube is a little bit more advanced. And I have the luxury of doing that because I have Grayson who does all of my audio and video editing. If you're just getting started with your podcast, I do really recommend that you just stick with audio. You can still put it up on YouTube even without all of the fancy video things that we were just talking about, by creating that cover art and just letting the cover art play through the entire podcast. It is not fancy. It is not appealing. Truthfully, it doesn't give anyone a reason to watch it on YouTube, but you can still put it up on YouTube and have kind of potentially twice the audience that way, while not having all of the extra work of doing the video versions of your podcast.
I would make sure before you decide to do video, there's a reason for you to do it too, because I see a lot of podcasts where it's just the cover art that plays through the entire episode, and YouTube doesn't let you listen to things after like if you're on your phone, you can't lock your phone and listen to YouTube without YouTube Premium.
Yeah,
so
that really annoys me.
There's really no point in putting your podcast on YouTube unless you have a reason for it. However, you should probably still record video so you can put clips and teasers on Instagram with video, because it's not very attention grabbing to just have your title card play with audio over top of it. People aren't going to watch it. But yeah, I would make sure that you actually have a reason to do it.
Yeah. So for me, again, I do it because Grayson does it all for me. But I wanted to start recording videos so that I had it to use for social media. And I figured if we're doing it for that already anyway, it's actually a lot of extra work for him to do the video version, which I didn't realize when I underwent that project. But now we've started it, so I'm not going to stop. But definitely something that you want to like really consider about like what your time and capabilities are, or what your budget is to hire help before taking on that project. But before you kind of go down the road of YouTube, I do recommend that you create an audio version of intro and outro for your actual podcast, because it's going to help you I'm going to say retain more of the listeners by giving them some of those specific instructions and information about your podcast, and just kind of have a more professional feel like we already mentioned. So I hope that you guys found some useful information in this video. Okay. Sorry. We'll just reverse that.
Just one more thing. The only other thing I would say is make sure you've got the right dimension. Like if you're recording video for YouTube, it has to be like 16 by 9, 19, 20 by 10.
I call it horizontal.
If you're recording vertical, it'll have like these terrible bars that nobody ever wants to see when they're trying to watch video on YouTube. So yeah, you got to make sure you got the right format. If you're recording video for Instagram, then you should record it vertically, because if you record it horizontally, you're gonna have the worst time ever, and it'll take you way longer to format your clips and stuff. So
You know those annoying black bars Grayson was just talking about? Well, instead of being on the side, Instagram puts them on the top and the bottom.
yeah, so you've
You
got
don't
to make
want
sure
those either.
you've got to make sure you're recording in the right aspect ratio for what you're actually doing. And when you're doing your intro, your title cards, you want to make sure they're the right size, or else you might have to add bars onto the side, which doesn't look good. So
Yes, that's a good point. And to be clear, when I record my podcast, I record on Zoom, which auto formats in a horizontal thing. So when I create my social media content, I have to run everything through Canva. I'm not just posting a snippet of the Zoom from the podcast, because I don't want those black bars. A, because I just don't think it looks aesthetic, and B, because the platform will actually deprioritize the content, meaning that people are not going to see it as much. So why go through all the work if you're not going to make it what Instagram wants to show it to the most people? Because that's obviously the goal of why you're talking about your podcast on social media. So a little bit of a digression there, but good points on making sure you're recording in the right formats. So if you guys have any questions after listening to today's episode, you're always welcome to message me on Instagram. That tends to be where I hang out most, or you can send me an email, and we're happy to kind of address some of this. If you listen to this and you're like, you know what, this is absolutely fantastic, but I just don't want to do it, you are more than welcome to contact us, and we would love to help you get set up with either a full podcast setup or just intro and outro creation for you. We also have podcast management options if you want to be like me and you just do all the fun stuff of recording, and then you send the file to Grayson and be like, do that. So we'll put some information about that in the show notes for this podcast as well, so you can learn more about what services we offer. But yeah, just to kind of quickly summarize what we talked about today, intros and outros you should have for your podcast. And then we talked about some of the things that you can put in them, and then just some of the technical aspects of how to actually put it all together. So thank you guys so much for listening, and we will see you back here next week.
bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Go Get Great. I hope you found some useful tips and tricks that can help you make life and business work together. If what I said resonates with you, please share it on social media, and don't forget to tag at Brittany Miller Socials so that I can celebrate you for taking those first steps towards achieving greatness. Remember, success doesn't happen overnight. It takes dedication, hard work, and a lot of spirit. So don't be afraid to dream big and go after what you want. Keep striving for greatness. You get closer with every step forward, no matter how small they may seem. Until next time, go get great.